Hey listeners, today we have a treat for you. Our guest Xenia has given our listeners 30% off the first 3 months of Planable using the coupon Site Visibility 30. That's Site Visibility 30. All you need to do is enter that during the checkout process. Thanks, Planable.
This is Internet Marketing.
Hello and welcome to the Internet Marketing Podcast brought to you by Site Visibility. I'm your host, Scott.colenutt, and with me today is Xenia Muntean, CEO and co-founder of Planable, and we're going to be talking about how to build effective social media teams. Welcome to the podcast, Xenia.
Thank you so much for having me here, Scott. I really appreciate it.
No problem. So would you mind taking a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners and note a little more on what you do at Planable?
Yeah, 100%. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Planable, which is a content review and marketing collaboration platform. So we're working with brands such as Jaguar, Land Rover, Hyundai, the United Nations, Siemens, to help them streamline the way they create and collaborate on content. And before Planable, I was also in the advertising world. I had a small social media marketing agency, and building, running, managing that agency, that's where I discovered the problem that we're currently solving with Planable. I really hated working in PowerPoints and spreadsheets on content. And yeah, I started Planable to solve this problem.
And how long ago was it that you started Planable now?
Yeah, I co-founded the company together with my partners, Vlad and Nick, about 5 years ago. So yeah, but we've been on the market with the product for about 2 to 3 years, not more than that.
You mentioned that you've been in advertising before. You also are a podcast host yourself, a writer, former graphic designer, copywriter, account manager. So you've definitely had a number of roles and a diverse number of roles in this marketing and creative space.
I think that prepared me well for being a CEO, wearing a lot of hats.
Yeah, no, that's interesting actually. And it's a good starting point for our podcast because you've been there, you've had to build social teams yourself, you've been a part of that creative team yourself. And that was my opening question is I want to go into the trends that you see now as a CEO and running a social media SaaS company. I don't know if that's how you describe it, but that's kind of how I see the product. Yeah. And so I'm interested to know your environments that you've been in that have been really beneficial to you in your career and that you think get the most out of you as a social media marketer and get the most out of social media teams that you've been in. Can you describe those environments, those successful social media environments that you've been in?
Yeah, 100%. So I have gone through a few environments. I have built a digital marketing team in an agency when I launched and started my own agency, and then built a marketing team here at Planable. And then I've seen a lot of our own clients building their own teams and optimizing and growing those teams. And recently, we also did a study on how companies in 2020 have grown their social media teams. And we made a top of 100 companies that have really invested in 2020 in their teams against all odds, considering the pandemic. So I've seen it from different angles. Back in my agency days, I think the social media world was very different from how it is today. Social media wasn't that strategical as it is today. It wasn't as important of a part of the entire marketing mix. So it was really about, posting and getting, things, promoting things, putting them out there online. But it wasn't as intentional and as strategical as it is today. So really back then when you were looking at growing a team, it was really about copywriting skills. That was really important. Creativity and, bonus points if someone could use the, Canva and potentially Photoshop a little bit, something like that, so that they can do some design or some templates for social media. Now I think it's more and more about how can you prove the ROI of social media and how can you tie the efforts on social media to the business goals, to the general, revenue, sales, branding, employer branding, whatever those goals are. How can you tie social media to that? And I think, social media has become more and more like almost like it serves a lot of the stakeholders inside the company. So it has become this kind of like an agency in a way, meaning that a lot of the other departments in an organization come to social media teams to get something communicated out there. So they need to think about the different needs of different departments, such as, what does HR want in terms of reflecting their image on social media? What are the goals of sales? What are the goals of marketing, and so on? So I think it has become more integrated into the organizations and definitely more strategical.
That's really interesting to think about that development over social media. And
yeah,
I think that what fascinates me maybe is the measurement side of things. So it sounds like, as you're talking, that perhaps how social media success is defined has also changed or developed over that period of time. So perhaps there is more of a focus on, you mentioned return on investment at this point in time, whereas maybe 5-10 years ago, it was more experimentation. There was less of a pressure or focused on return on investment. Is that fair?
Yeah, it wasn't a long-term game a couple of years ago. It was, and you could see that by the metrics we were tracking back then, like likes and comments and shares and vanity metrics. They were instant gratification and instant metrics. That was what we were looking at. Probably the biggest long-term type of metric that we were following was how many followers you had for your page. That was the only one that, was a bit more long-term compared to the others. So I think, if you look at the metrics we were analyzing, you could see that we weren't really playing for the long run. It was really about, this particular post, how well it is performing. And we weren't thinking about how the entire social media presence is performing and how that impacts, in the end, other business metrics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm sure we'll break that down a little bit further in a moment as we start to talk about other social media teams that you support at Planable and others that you've been involved with. But before we get into that, I was really interested. I was thinking about this episode and thinking, as a social media SaaS platform, I wanted to know if you felt any extra pressure to be super creative via social media. Was that ever a part of the plan? Did you ever feel that pressure or want to be more creative because of your role in social media?
100%. And that was such a big struggle, to be honest, because the way we were bringing customers initially wasn't really through social media. It was inbound marketing, but it was more about our blog, about SEO, direct outreach sometimes. So social media wasn't really something that we proved to be bringing customers directly. And we also needed short-term results because we were trying to prove the business. We were trying to prove that the product is something people need and love. So social media being a longer-term game, we weren't really focusing on it that much. We were really, actually, we didn't have an Instagram page until recently. And we started doing a lot more social media just because we realized that, being in this space, it's a bit embarrassing not to have a presence on social media, not to have content. So we started doing it, just because we felt that we needed, considering the space we were in, but we were doing it very, light touch. And then in time, we started seeing, a lot more engagement from people, and we're starting to see, that it actually drives results. It started to drive traffic. We started to see, people interacting with our content. We started to build relationships with those audiences on different platforms. So we started to invest a little bit more on social media. And just, I think, half an hour before we started, recording this podcast, something amazing happened on social media for us. I think it's the first time we have created something for social media that has actually gone, viral in our industry. I wouldn't say like viral in general. That's, a big word, but semi-viral in our small niche. We have created a lot of content around around social media teams. And someone else shared it in a Facebook group dedicated for social media professionals. And overnight, it got like 600 likes and 100 comments or something like that, and people started sharing it on Twitter. So we realized that, creating content is one thing, but then you have to find ways of creating bits, snackable bits out of that big content piece and find creative ways of putting it online so that people can pick it up. And the way that person shared the top was through this, idea that, here's, this big companies that are hiring, like Amazon and Microsoft, and they're hiring heavily on social media. So of course they have a lot of success. But I have smaller clients that are not ready to invest in social media, but they want to go viral as Amazon and Microsoft are. So that was an interesting, angle that they approached the piece of content that we have created, a bit more controversial that we didn't think about. So you really need to find, very ingenious ways of putting your content out there on social media. And it might, if it resonates with your audience, it might get picked up.
We'll talk about Social 100 maybe towards the end of this episode. But number one, congratulations. It's brought a smile to my face hearing that story. It's always
Thank you.
Amazing with social media when you put something out there into the world. And as you said, maybe someone else promotes it or looks at that thing in a way different to how you've looked at it previously. And that is one of the beautiful things about social media. But that's also something very specific about the top 100 that you've produced. It's data led. And so data, when you present data in that way, it gives room for people to interpret it in a number of different ways.
Exactly.
So in a way that it kind of builds marketing into the product that you're sending out or into the content that you're sending out to the world. Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. And again, we'll get back to that Social 100 in a moment as well. That's brilliant. So you mentioned at the beginning there, you work with around 5,000 companies. I'm going to read out some of the names of the companies because they're amazing brands. I've got them in front of me: Jaguar, Land Rover, Siemens, United Nations. And when you work with that number of companies and you work with big corporations, in fact, even just a diversity of companies that you work with, you start to spot the trends in what makes social teams successful. And of course, that's what you've put into that work on the Social 100 as well. So I'm just curious to know, and this could be over a period of time or just as you see it today, but are there any trends that you see that make social media teams successful? Any commonalities between them all?
Yeah, I think from our own perspective, we worked a lot with teams and some of the companies that you mentioned to help them be more efficient and more productive. Mm-hmm. So from our own point of view, the teams that really focus on teamwork and time management and the teams that are really flexible and that have those organizational skills built in, the teams that are really collaborative, those are the ones that succeed the most. We obviously, see those skills through our own filter because that's, what we help with. But I think if the teams really focus on collaboration, on teamwork, I think that is extremely crucial nowadays, just because if there is an efficient teamwork, if people really collaborate, you might get better and brighter ideas. That's first of all, your content might be of a better quality. And then the second is that you might avoid mistakes or gaps. We've seen so many social media posts go wrong on Twitter, on Instagram, on other platforms. Posts that have, I fail to see how they could have been published if more people would have taken a look at them. So I think, it's extremely important to have multiple points of view involved in the process of creating content for social. Some kind of approval process that is put in place. It might be a very light touch approval process, just someone reviewing content, or it might be a more sophisticated one where, depending on the industry, you actually might need to go through multiple levels of approval. For example, if you're in a regulated industry and you need, compliance and legal to take a look at your posts before they go live, such as, the pharma industry, tobacco, alcohol, those industries usually need to have more people involved in the process. So if you build a team that is, for teamwork and for collaboration, I think that is going to create in the end a better quality for your content.
So to summarize, what I'm hearing is that you very much see the companies that focus on teamwork or culture first brings about the best of a social media team. Is that fair?
100%. And you got to have the base, you got to have the fundamentals, right? I mean, people need to be talented, all those hard skills, right? Copywriting and creativity and strategy and data and analytics and all of those things. Obviously, they need to be there. But I think, those are the default. So I usually focus on the soft skills, like what makes the chemistry of a team, what makes it tick, what makes it work really. And I think, the teams that are flexible, that are collaborative, that love to exchange feedback, not just, do it because that's the process, because that's the policy, but the teams that really love to talk between each other, to exchange opinions, to ask for feedback. And those teams that know how to give feedback, because that's a skill as well, to know how to give feedback. Those teams that are flexible in that regard, and those teams that are really, focused on how can we be, okay, we're collaborative, but how can we also be more productive? How can we optimize the workflow and the processes that we have currently in place? Like where do we lose the most time? I'm a productivity geek myself, so, always I'm looking at our teams at Planable, our marketing teams, our operational teams, our engineering teams, and I'm always trying to find what are the bottlenecks? Like, how can we move faster? How can we get to market faster in terms of new features, in terms of content pieces? And what's currently stopping us from doing that? And you always find some small bottlenecks. And if you do this exercise from time to time, you're going to find different bottlenecks from time to time because your team evolves, a lot of things change, your processes change. But it's really important to just ask yourself. It's not the most sexy question in the world. How can we improve our operations? And especially for marketers that are, really focused on creativity. It's a hard question to go through, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's helped me reframe a question that I was going to ask you anyway. So
yeah.
I was thinking about, I've seen some of your content and this really leads into what Planable is all about. But I was going to ask you, what are some of the things that frustrate social media marketers and really stifle success and creativity? And you talked about process and bottlenecks there. But one way that I thought to reframe that question is what makes social media less fun for the people that are out there doing it? Because I think because like you just said, social media marketers are generally want to be creative, want to express themselves. Whether they know it or not, they probably don't want those bottlenecks to be there, or they don't realize how much they're impacting them. So yeah, I'm curious to know, for social media marketers, what have you seen in your experience that really slows the process and takes the enjoyment out of social media? What are some of the things for people to look out for?
Yeah, there's so many of them. I don't know where to start. I think nobody likes approvals and an approval process. Nobody likes to wait for people to review content. I haven't heard any marketers say that, my favorite part of my day is getting approvals and feedback from clients or from stakeholders. Nobody enjoys that. And I think nobody enjoys that because it's usually a very clunky and troublesome and just unenjoyable process. It has steps and policies, and it's hard. It's a difficult process. Also, I don't think a lot of social media marketers enjoy just planning content in spreadsheets. I, for sure, didn't enjoy it back then. I think, planning editorial calendars and content in spreadsheets it sucks because it's really, it's not an environment that is designed for visual content in mind. So you plan all your content. There's no way to actually preview how your content is going to look like. And then you have to do a lot of copy pasting from that spreadsheet to some scheduling tool that you use or to the native platforms to schedule or publish the content in the end. So it's a lot of bureaucratic, tedious steps that go into the process of creating and planning content. So I think the entire workflow has a lot of those types of steps, like the spreadsheet itself, then, organizing your assets and your media is also something that, no one likes to do. Trying to find an image in a drive folder is a pain sometimes. I've read somewhere that there was a report on how much professionals and how much marketers waste on how much time is wasted on finding files and finding assets. And I've heard that it was something around like 1 hour a day that people lose in terms of trying to find information. That's how isolated teams usually are. That was a report about silos and enterprises. That's, just trying to find stuff is also something that people don't really enjoy. And just I think, those small steps like the copy pasting, the finding information, organizing them in a spreadsheet, the entire back and forth that happens when you're discussing content, when you're coordinating what content needs to be put out there on social media, waiting for approvals, waiting for someone else to review it. Those are not fun things. But at the same time, I do think those things are useful. Getting feedback and having a fail-safe mechanism like an approval process or a review process in place so that things, don't go wrong on social media and you don't post the wrong thing. I think an additional pair of eyes is useful. So the question is, how do you do all those things without going crazy and without being bored to death? And I think the answer is you gotta find a way to make it as simple as possible. And there is no secret sauce for how a process or a workflow in terms of building content for social media needs to look like, because teams are so different. It really depends on how small your team is, how big it is, what kind of steps do you have in place, how many people are creating content, how many people are reviewing it. So it really varies. But you got to find the simplest way that brings everyone involved on the same page and that makes, I wouldn't say enjoyable, but at least, doable, survivable, that makes the entire process acceptable. I think that's the question, the big one.
And I think that's where we should insert an ad for Planable, because it's the perfect summary of kind of all of the problems that Planable is there to solve.
And of course, yes, but not just. Yes, of course, I would recommend Planable. I'm biased, but it might be something simpler. It might be potentially, other generic tools. Like you might find a way to make it work with Notion or with Airtable, where, alternatives to spreadsheets. Maybe you can actually make it work with the spreadsheet, but the idea is simplify. How can you simplify it and connect it, make it united so that there is that the entire process is not fragmented. I feel like that's the main issue, that currently it's fragmented. You plan it in a spreadsheet, but then you discuss it over an email or Slack, and then you keep your files somewhere else, like in a Drive or Dropbox folder. So how can you bring your entire content and everyone involved in the same place and not have this disconnect between steps? And you might achieve that with Planable. You will certainly achieve that with Planable, but then you might achieve it with, other tools. And the idea is to have that willingness to streamline.
Excellent. And interesting, you touched on a topic that I wanted to go into as well. You talked a lot about unity there, about you being unified as a team. You talked a lot about teamwork and collaboration. And my question is quite a broad one and a loaded question, but I think of social media managers out there who are perhaps in big companies and are given the responsibility to manage social media as their own one-person department. And the way I've seen social media develop is that I see it being more beneficial of social media being seen as a way to represent all of the voices in your business. Do you think it's helpful to get lots of your team, regardless of whether they're social media specialists or not, involved in social media? And is that the way you think things are going in larger corporations?
I think there is a degree of involvement that is useful, and then there's a degree of involvement that might be disruptive. I think getting not just the marketing teams, the PR, the brand teams, comms teams involved in a light way, in a small way, in the social media efforts of the brand of the organization is 100% useful. As I mentioned, earlier, it's a lot about diversity of opinion and more people having an input into the social media space. But where I find it even more useful is having product teams and HR teams and sales teams and commercial teams, legal teams sometimes involved in the process, because a lot of the times, big organizations have those teams that really don't talk that much between each other. And someone, is in charge of developing the product. But then, the message breaks until, it gets from the product team to the social media team. So I think, having those decentralized ways of talking between each other and getting input from product teams, getting input from development teams, engineering teams, sales teams, HR teams for employer branding and recruitment and that those types of topics. I think that is extremely helpful because you get to create content that is more relevant and that serves a bigger part of the entire organization. Social media is not just about marketing. It's not just about selling the products. It's not just about revenue. It's also about the brand. It's also about the reputation of the company. It's also about potentially the executive team. You might, talk on social media about the CEOs and the CMOs and the stakeholders. It's also about corporate responsibility, CSR initiatives. So it's a lot of things. So I think in order to do that accurately and to communicate the message that really represents all those initiatives from inside the brand, I don't think there's any other way than just having those teams take a look at the content that is relevant for them. And yeah, you need to find a, simple way of getting them involved in the process, an easy way, because, otherwise you risk of putting content out there that doesn't represent the product or doesn't represent the employer branding strategy or the executive's brand strategy in a relevant or appropriate way. So I think there is merit to that 100%.
And how does it work at Planable? So you mentioned your co-founders earlier. Could you provide any insight into what it's like behind the scenes at Planable and how you plan out your social content? How do you split the roles of social media between you all?
So I recently learned that there's a term for what we do at Planable in terms of how we structure the company. There's a book on this, actually. It's called Team of Teams. And it's funny because I didn't know there's a framework for this. We were naturally just doing this, but apparently there's an entire philosophy on this. And for those out there that haven't read or haven't heard about the book, Team of Teams is, as opposed to the traditional ways of structuring a company where you have the executive team and then each department is, reports to those particular executive. And if the departments want to talk between each other, they need to go through the executives. But the team of teams is just, everyone is interconnected. Everyone has a way of communicating with everyone else in the company. And us at Planable being a very small team, or 20 people on the team at the moment, it just naturally evolved as a team of teams. And I think most modern teams and definitely most startup teams operate in this framework of team of teams. Everyone is connected to everyone. And everyone has a line of communication, a direct line of communication to everyone else in the company. And I think that's amazing. Someone that is in charge of writing content for our blog can easily, while they're using Planable, spot a bug in the platform, and they have a direct way of reporting it to our QA specialist, to our quality assurance specialist. And that's amazing. They don't have to go through me or through our chief technology officer. And in terms of the social media team, in terms of the marketing team, the way we're structured is that, our team is really a growth marketing team. And in the beginning, it was very versatile. So everyone was doing everything. Everyone was doing a bit of newsletters, a bit of blog, a bit of social media, a bit of ads. And then in time, across this 2 or 3 years since we started marketing our product, each professional, each marketer and the marketing team started to naturally specialize in what they were most passionate and what they were best at. And now each marketer at Planable has like a ownership on particular directions that are important for our growth, such as SEO, paid content, and so on. And I think that comes naturally, but I think without even realizing, we started very well. We started with this idea of everyone has to do everything, and I think if you're an early stage startup, if you're an early stage small business, it is so, so important that the people in your company are jack of all trades. I'm a big fan of that, but then it comes a time when, people need to specialize.
Well, that's interesting. And it leads me nicely onto a final question about characteristics and kind of skills in this area to build an effective social media team. And I see there and have seen that over the years, there's a lot of crossover between what content marketers try to achieve and what social media marketers try to achieve. And so I'm interested to know from your experience, do you think there's a natural transition there and that content marketers can make good social media marketers, and likewise, social media marketers can make good content marketers? Do you think those two areas are as closely aligned today as maybe they were a few years ago?
That's a good question. I honestly see the content managers. I think a content manager needs to know, a content creator, content marketer needs to know social media, but I see it. They're not necessarily a social media expert. They need to know the basic. They need to know how it works. Content marketer needs to know how every channel out there works, right? Newsletters, because that's where their content is going to be deployed. So I think a content marketer can, if they, want to specialize into the social media space, they definitely have a path to that because they are supposed to know a little bit of everything in terms of the channels, and also they usually have great copywriting skills, which is really necessary for the social media space. They know how to manage those platforms out there, are aware of how social media works, the relationship, the psychology of social media. But at the same time, I think, it also goes the other way around. A social media person is usually, where a social media person lacks in terms of becoming a content marketer is potentially, I think it's easier to go from a content marketer to a social media person rather from a social media person to a content marketer. It's kind of like a social media person would need to widen the range of skills, and a content marketer would need to become more focused on a particular skill that they have. Personally, I think it's easier to go from wide to focused rather than the other way around.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's just an area I've been thinking about a lot. Actually, this next area that I'm going to talk about and ask you about is an area that I've been thinking a lot about too. So very early on in this conversation, you were talking about how social media has developed and how the role of the social media marketer has developed, perhaps from being more day-to-day, more experimental, more tactical to more longer term and strategic. And I was thinking about that in context of planning. I remember a time where social media planning maybe used to look at the month ahead. That was maybe it, or maybe the quarter ahead. It feels to me like the trend that I see now ties in with the point that you made about strategy, and that social media teams are maybe looking at the year ahead, thinking about campaigns within that year.
Yeah.
Is that a fair observation that I've seen and something you've seen too?
100%. I think teams are becoming a bit more agile, and that idea that they're not as responsive and a bit more proactive than they were before. It's less of what are we going to post this next week, and more of what is this year going to look like on social.
That's interesting. And again, I was thinking about Planable and the fact that really you have the content calendar features that really helps to solve that long-term problem as well.
It really does. Because you might not plan your entire content at the very granular level for a year in advance. That wouldn't really be possible. I mean, it is possible, but then you lose some of that reactiveness, some of that real-timeness that is very important for social media. But you could map the big things. Like we've seen customers that map relevant events for their industry, like Paris Fashion Week or the Oscars or that type of stuff. So they map it out and they know that, in February, we need to talk about that thing. So they map out kind of like a calendar of events, and they know that they need to prepare at least 3 months in advance for Black Friday and what's going to happen in November. So it really helps out. So it's more high level across the year, then that helps them to go a bit more granularly into the content planning.
And I wanted to close out today's episode talking more about Social Teams 100 that you referenced a few times throughout this episode. So for our listeners, can you maybe describe what Social Teams 100 is, why you created it, and then maybe some of the insights that you found most interesting from this research and exercise.
Yeah, so the story behind Social Teams 100 is that across the year, we've obviously had a very intimate insight of what happens with social media teams and social media organizations just by seeing, what teams have grown, the teams that needed bigger plans on Planable, that needed more users on Planable. But at the same time, we've seen obviously customers that had to cancel their subscription with Planable because they either didn't have, sadly didn't have any clients, or they a lot of layoffs happened in the company. So we started asking ourselves, what's the difference? Like, what happens? There seems like the contrast is quite big. There's these teams that are really, really succeeding and growing quite a lot across the year, across 2020. And then there's just teams that aren't, really making it. Is it as obvious as just the industry that they're in, like travel and, the industries that have been hit the most? Or is there something else behind this? So we set up to do a bit of research, and we made a top of 100 teams, 100 companies that have grown their social media teams, that have invested and increased their social media headcount in 2020. And we thought that those teams have to be celebrated. They must be celebrated because of how hard 2020 was. And because if you hired in 2020 on any position, but especially if you hired in 2020 on social media positions, I think that is a signal that your company is doing well. So we made this entire list. We published the list together with a bunch of information regarding those companies. But we also took a look at some other stats, some other collateral stats that came out of this entire list, such as top industries that have hired the most social media professionals in 2020. And not surprising at all, the biggest industry was the internet industry, and then afterwards computer software, and then which was really nice, the marketing and advertising industry. That means the agencies. So that was very interesting to see, but it kind of made a lot of sense. It was an assumption that we had, and it was really validated. An industry that popped up that we didn't expect was the higher ed industry. But then, if you think about it, kind of made sense considering that, universities had to go fully digital in a matter of seconds. Yeah. And they, most of them probably weren't that prepared for, becoming fully digital. So they needed to kind of keep in touch with their students, have some way of engaging them, communities, all of that. So it made a lot of sense that they started, hiring more for digital roles and social media roles. And then we looked at other things like departments, years of seniority, how experienced were the people finding a new social media role in 2020. And we've seen that it's an average of 6 years. So that was an interesting fact. And then we looked at titles and the best month when people started a new social media job in 2020. And that was actually September. Again, if you think about it, it really makes sense because probably no one hired in March or April or, June and the spring at the beginning of the pandemic. All recruitment processes were probably put on stop. Even those companies that were, successful, there was a level of kind of, I wouldn't say panic, but a lot of companies were very cautious investing in anything really. So probably all recruitment processes stopped. And in September, the companies that, were in July, August, all the companies that were doing well and needed more social media professionals in their teams have started hiring. Hence, September was the month that a lot of people started new jobs in the social media space. And then, we looked at top cities in the US specifically, where most people got a new social media professional job, and it was New York, LA, and Chicago. So interesting facts like that that we wanted to shine a bit of light on.
And is that something you're planning to do again in 2021 and then compare the results?
So a lot of people are actually asking us if we're going to do this. And in the beginning, we thought this is going to be just a one-time thing that we're going to do for 2020. But now we're reconsidering, especially in the light of this thing going a little bit viral. And people, some other people asked us this again. So we're considering of doing this. Especially for the reason that you mentioned, being able to compare them across years. I think that's going to be interesting. So we're considering it.
And one thing, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this from your research or just from your observations, but I'm curious to know whether niche social media roles are on the rise. And what I mean by that, I remember seeing somewhere that the title of manager was the most hired role, but I'm interested to know whether platform-specific roles are on the rise. So whether people are looking for Instagram specialists or Twitter specialists or Clubhouse or whatever it is.
Oh, that's interesting.
Do you happen to have it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We didn't look at it, but that's a very interesting question for next year. I'm not sure. Most of our research was based on LinkedIn data, so I'm not sure if people put it as TikTok specialist in their title, or do they rather just say it's just social media specialist. So that's something to look. But I would love to have the answer to this question as well. Maybe we can find a way for next year to uncover this.
That'd be very interesting. It leads me nicely, actually, into my final question for you today. And I couldn't, someone that's in the social media space, I couldn't let you go without asking about things that you're excited about in social media. So whether that's new platforms that are emerging, apps that are emerging, or perhaps features within existing platforms. What's exciting you, and what do you think is going to be big for the year ahead?
I am excited about Clubhouse, to be honest. We haven't really done anything on Clubhouse. I haven't done anything. I have engaged, personally with Clubhouse, but we're gonna do an experiment with Clubhouse in this month. We're gonna do a group on, being March Women's International Month. We're gonna do a panel with female leaders in social media marketing, and I'm very excited to see how this is I've heard so much about Clubhouse, its virality effect, the networking potential, all of that, but we haven't really done anything. So I'm really, really curious to see how this is going to go. I think, and generally, looking at social media and what's happening in this particular time, there's so many niche social media apps that are popping up. TikTok is an older one, but still it's, quite a niche one. Clubhouse, Dispo, there's so many out there. And I think it's an exciting time because, for a very long time, there was just, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or all of those guys that have been for, a while, and we weren't really seeing anything new. And I think, I think it's very interesting that we have so many new, fresh, and vibrant platforms out there.
No, that's something I'd agree with. It feels like we're either on the cusp or have just entered this kind of new era of social media marketing. And you've just named a few platforms there as you were talking that have really risen in popularity over this last year to 2 years. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. And best of luck with any experimentation on Clubhouse as well.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and Planable?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so if they want to learn more about Planable, they can just check out our website, planable.io. That's planable.io. And then if they want to connect with me, I hang out on LinkedIn the most. So you can send me a connection request. Let me know that you heard me on this podcast. And I'd love to chat with you.
Thanks so much for your time today and all of your insight, and best of luck for everything that you do. And I look forward to hopefully seeing this Social Teams 100 in 2021 possibly as well.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Scott, for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Take care.